Single dad breaks down in public. A woman's hand on his shoulder changed everything. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the cereal aisle, hands trembling, as he stared at the price tag for a box of oatmeal. Sophie liked the apple cinnamon kind, but even with coupons and discounts, every item felt like a decision between enough and too much. He had a budget, a tight one. Rent was due. His car made a strange noise every time it turned left, and Sophie needed new shoes. He hadn't told her. She never asked. A child's voice in another aisle giggled. It sounded like Sophie used to before the tiredness crept into her laughter too. Daniel blinked back the sting behind his eyes. He wasn't supposed to cry. Not here. Not where anyone could see. But the box in his hands blurred. His chest tightened. His body didn't care about pride anymore. It just sagged under the weight of being everything at once. And then a soft hand touched his shoulder. Warm, still. He turned. A woman stood beside him around his age. Dark coat, calm eyes. Her presence didn't say what's wrong. It said, I see you. No pity, just stillness. You're doing great, she said softly, even if it doesn't feel like it. Daniel swallowed hard. He managed a nod, maybe a whisper, maybe a thank you. She didn't press, didn't ask for his story. Just reached into his cart, placed the oatmeal gently inside and smiled. Come on, checkout's this way. Daniel couldn't remember the last time someone touched his shoulder without needing something from him. Not to hurry him, not to correct him, not to lean in with a whisper of worry or a demand, but to offer comfort. Wordless, gentle comfort. The woman didn't pull her hand away too fast nor linger long enough to make it awkward. She just stood beside him as if she'd known him long enough to understand silence sometimes speaks louder than sympathy. Grace, she said, simply, her voice low, almost private in the hum of the grocery store. You don't need to explain anything. Daniel blinked, chest still tight, the oatmeal box still in his hands. I'm sorry, he murmured, embarrassed. I didn't mean to. You don't have to apologize, she said. The world's heavy. That's not your fault. He glanced at her. She wasn't overly dressed or carrying a shopping basket. Just a woman passing through, apparently, who stopped when she saw something break in someone else. Yeah, I'm fine, he added out of habit. Just tired. Grace gave a nod that told him she'd heard that line before from others, maybe from herself. She gestured gently to the cart. Let's finish together. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. They walked down the rest of the aisle like old acquaintances who had forgotten the details, but not the rhythm. She didn't pry. He didn't pretend. At the checkout, she waited with him, quiet, composed. When he fumbled for his worn-out loyalty card, she smiled and handed it to the cashier without a word. When it was over and the bags were packed, she turned to him. I'm not always in this store, she said, but I'm always nearby. Then she walked away, no phone number, no awkward promise, no strings, just Grace, and the hand that reminded Daniel that maybe, just maybe, someone still saw him, and that in a world where he'd grown used to being invisible meant everything. Daniel stared at the total on the checkout screen. It wasn't much, just a gallon of milk cereal eggs and a loaf of bread, but somehow it felt like too much. He reached for his wallet, fingers trembling slightly, already calculating what he might have to put back. Grace, still beside him, didn't say a word. Instead, she stepped forward and calmly tapped her card. He turned sharply. No, I can't. You can, she said gently, and you're not taking anything from me, just letting me do what someone once did for me. The cashier gave him a soft, understanding look as the receipt printed. Daniel stood there, still gripping the edge of the counter. You didn't have to. Grace smiled, picking up one of the paper bags, but I wanted to. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. They walked side by side toward his old car, its passenger door held shut with a strip of duct tape. Grace didn't stare or comment. Instead, she asked, How old is your daughter? Daniel blinked. Lily Shay's 9. Turning 10 in the fall. She likes strawberry milk. He chuckled. She says it tastes like Saturdays. Grace smiled at that. She sounds wonderful. She is, he said, and then quieter. She's the reason I keep showing up. They reached the car and he loaded the bags into the back seat. Grace stood by, hands folded. I wasn't planning to cry in aisle 5 today, he admitted, embarrassed. I wasn't planning to be there either, she said, but I'm glad I was. He hesitated before opening the driver's door. Do you help people often like this? Grace thought about it. Not often, just when it feels right. Daniel looked at her, trying to read her. But there was no agenda in her eyes. No pity, just presence. Thank you, he said finally. She nodded. You're welcome, Daniel. He didn't remember telling her his name, but somehow it didn't surprise him that she already knew. By the time Daniel finished loading the last bag and turned to speak again, she was already stepping away. Wait, can I at least repay you somehow? He asked, voice low but urgent. He wasn't used to being helped without strings, and it tugged at something in him to let her go without doing something in return. Grace paused at the edge of the lot near the line of trees where mist still clung to the leaves. She turned, rain brushing gently across her shoulders. You already did, she said simply. He furrowed his brow. I don't understand. Grace offered a small, soft smile. Some kindnesses don't come with instructions. Just let it be what it was. And with that, she gave a small wave, turned and walked into the mist. No business card, no phone number, no way to track her down. Just a name. Grace. Daniel stood there a moment longer, hands still on the door frame, heart oddly heavy and light at the same time. He whispered it under his breath, as if trying to hold it in the air, Grace. And then he drove home groceries in the back seat and a stranger's kindness, sitting quietly beside him like a warm, invisible hand on his shoulder. The next morning, rain drummed softly on the window pane, the sky a sheet of gray. Daniel sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped still in the clothes he'd fallen asleep in. In the other room, his daughter Sophie was singing quietly to herself while drawing with crayons. The smell of instant oatmeal drifted in. But Daniel couldn't move yet. Not just yet. He kept seeing the image, a hand on his shoulder light, as breath but grounding. Grace's eyes had held no pity, only calm, only presence. And for the first time since losing Rachel, his wife, someone had met his grief without trying to fix it. His chest ached, not in the sharp, unbearable way it had when he'd first stood beside that hospital bed holding Sophie in one arm and Rachel's cold hand in the other. No, this ache was slower, steadier, a reminder of how long he'd been carrying everything on his own. And now someone had noticed. Just a name, just a stranger. But something in him felt different, not healed, not whole, but seen. Sophie padded into the room and held up a drawing, 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one with curly hair holding a blue umbrella. Is that us? Daniel asked gently, taking it. Sophie nodded, and the nice lady, she gave you magic, so you could smile again. He looked at the page, and for a moment he did. Daniel sat with Sophie at their small kitchen table, a mismatched pair of bowls between them, peanut butter sandwiches cut into crooked hearts, and apple slices browning slightly at the edges. The soft sound of afternoon rain tapped the windows, but inside warmth lingered in the laughter of a child who didn't yet know the weight her father carried. Sophie munched cheerfully, then slid a paper across the table toward him. I made her again, she said, beaming. It was a crayon drawing, a woman in a purple coat, a yellow umbrella, above her one hand on a taller figure's shoulder, Daniel's unmistakably. Sophie had even drawn his glasses. Daniel stared, his throat tightening. You remembered her? Sophie nodded. She looked kind, and you stopped crying after she touched you. He swallowed hard. The moment had been so brief, so unexpected. Yet somehow Sophie from her booster seat at the register had seen everything, seen more than he thought. She was nice, he said, softly tracing the edge of the drawing. Her name was Grace. Sophie smiled. Like the music word. Yeah, Daniel said. Just like that. He pinned the drawings to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a duck. For a moment, he didn't feel broken, just a little bent, held together by crayons, sandwiches, and a girl who believed strangers could be angels. The flyer had been taped to the community board outside Sophie's school neighborhood shelter needs help. Weekend food drive. Daniel didn't have much to give, but something inside him said to go. Maybe to show Sophie what kindness looked like. Maybe to pay forward what he still didn't fully understand. Sophie tugged his hand as they walked through the shelter's double doors, carrying 2 grocery bags with canned goods and instant noodles. The air smelled of warm soup and damp coats. Volunteers moved with purpose, stacking food boxes, handing out warm blankets. And then he saw her. Across the room, placing granola bars into brown paper bags, was Grace. Her hair was tied up, sleeves rolled, a soft focus in her eyes as she worked. She didn't notice him at first, not until Sophie squealed, "Daddy, it's her." Grace looked up, startled. Then slowly she smiled. Not surprised, not confused, like she'd been hoping he'd walk in someday. Daniel blinked. "I volunteer here on weekends," Grace said, gently wiping her hands on a cloth. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Sophie darted forward and hugged her. Daniel stood still, heart pounding. "I never got to thank you for that day at the store." Grace looked at him, eyes kind. "You don't have to, but I do," he said, "because something changed. That hand on my shoulder. It reminded me I wasn't invisible." Grace nodded. "None of us are. Sometimes we just forget." The shelter buzzed around them, but for a moment it was just the 3 of them. The man who'd broken down, the woman who didn't walk away, and the little girl who remembered everything in color. Daniel asked, "Need another set of hands today?" Grace's answer came with a warm smile. "Always." It was Thursday evening when Grace called. Daniel almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in his phone. But something nudged him. "Hi, it's Grace," she said. "From the shelter." His heart lifted just hearing her voice. "We're doing community night tomorrow," she continued. "Just warm soup music stories. Nothing fancy, but I thought Sophie might like it." Daniel glanced over at his daughter curled up with her crayons. She'd love it. Truthfully, so would he. The next night, the shelter's common room was transformed. Folding tables were covered in mismatched tablecloths. String lights hung from the ceiling like stars. The scent of homemade soup and fresh bread filled the space. Grace greeted them at the door with a ladle in one hand and a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Glad you came." Sophie clung to her stuffed bunny but smiled. "Hi, Miss Grace." They sat at a corner table while Grace served bowls of lentil soup still steaming. Daniel took a bite, simple, hearty, perfect. Sophie hummed as she dipped bread into her bowl. As the evening unfolded, someone played an old guitar. A teen from the shelter recited a poem. There was laughter, warmth. Daniel looked across the room and caught Grace watching them. Not judging, not pitying, just seeing. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something shift. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was trust. A first small step toward something gentle and real. As they left, Grace handed Sophie a paper cup of hot cocoa and slipped Daniel a folded flyer. "Next week's meal theme, chili and cornbread. Hope to see you again." He didn't need to read the fine print. The next week they came early. Sophie ran ahead, her ponytail bouncing, excited for chili and cornbread night. Daniel followed more slowly, a quiet rhythm settling into his step. The shelter had become a place of comfort, not a solution, but a pause, a place to breathe. Inside, Grace was struggling with something behind the kitchen counter, water dripping steadily into a bucket from a leaky faucet. "Stubborn thing's been leaking all morning," she muttered, brow furrowed bone. Daniel stepped closer. "Need a hand?" She looked up relieved. "If you know your way around a wrench, he'll owe you one." He chuckled. "You already paid that debt in lentils and cocoa." Grace handed him a toolbox and moved aside. As Daniel knelt by the sink, the familiar scent of worn copper and soap filled his nose. He tightened a valve, adjusted the gasket, wiped his hands on a towel. The dripping stopped. Grace watched, half smiling. You just saved me a plumbing bill. Daniel shrugged modestly. I can't fix everything, but this I can do. She nodded, quietly moved. That's more than most. Later that evening, as music filled the room again, and Sophie helped hand out napkins to the guests, Daniel sat beside Grace with 2 mugs of cider in hand. I used to be scared of places like this, he admitted. Felt like failure. Grace turned toward him. Shelters aren't failure. They're bridges. He looked down at his hands, callous, tired, useful. Then maybe it's time I start crossing one. After the dishes were cleared and the chatter quieted, Daniel lingered near the folding chairs while Sophie played with another child in the corner. Grace was tidying up, stacking napkins, and humming softly, the kind of song that held more memory than melody. Daniel approached slowly. You okay? Grace looked up and hesitated, then nodded with a small smile. Yeah. Just some nights, the quiet lands heavier than others. They moved to the side hallway where mismatched chairs lined the wall near the coat hooks. Grace handed him a cup of tea and sat down beside him, not quite looking at him. Do you believe talking to someone helps? She asked. He thought about it. Sometimes. But writing helped me more. Her fingers curled around her cup. Me too. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was faded corners, soft from years of handling. She opened it, revealing pages filled with neat, slanted handwriting. I started writing letters to my son after he passed, she said. Her voice didn't shake, it softened. Every time I missed him, I wrote as if he were just away for a while. Daniel didn't interrupt. I never mailed them, obviously, but I kept them. It helped me hold on and let go at the same time. She turned one page slowly. This one was from his would-have-been 10th birthday. I told him about the rain, the candles I lit, and how I imagined what kind of cake he'd like now. Daniel's throat tightened. Do you still write? Grace nodded. Not as often, but sometimes when the world feels too loud or too empty. He looked at her, not with pity, but understanding. Maybe we're all carrying letters we never send. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe we're just waiting for the right hands to pass them to. That night, as they stood to leave, Grace slipped the notebook back into her bag. Daniel offered quietly, if you ever want someone to read one, I'd be honored. She paused and nodded. A door had opened, not loudly but fully. The air was warm with late spring sunlight, and the city park buzzed gently with life. The quiet rhythm of children laughing, birds overhead, and the soft creak of swings moving in the breeze. Daniel sat on a worn bench, coffee in hand, watching his daughter Sophie race toward the jungle gym. She was beaming. Not because of the park itself, they'd been here countless times, but because Grace was with them. Grace had brought a bag of chalk and bubbles, and Sophie had practically dragged her by the hand toward the sidewalk. You draw, I blow, she declared, and the two got to work like old friends. Grace crouched beside Sophie, letting her guide the chalk into wild, looping hearts and flowers. She didn't try to correct her, didn't talk down to her. She just followed her lead, laughing when Sophie smeared blue across her own nose. From the bench, Daniel couldn't help but smile. He hadn't seen Sophie this alive in weeks, not since her last birthday, not since the weight of everything had started settling on her little shoulders. Grace caught his eye once, just briefly, and gave a soft, wordless nod. A gesture that said, I see her. I see you too. He felt something loosen inside. They weren't a family, not yet, maybe not ever. But for that moment, they were 3 people in the sun healing something invisible together. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel like he was barely holding it all together. He just felt present. Daniel didn't know what to expect when he arrived at the small office building tucked between a bakery and a second-hand bookstore. He only knew Grace had handed him a slip of paper days earlier. No explanation, just a gentle, you should check this place out. The paper had a name, a number, and a quiet kind of hope. Now dressed in his cleanest shirt, hands still bearing faint paint stains from patching up Sophie's bedroom, Daniel stepped inside. The receptionist smiled warmly. Mr. Ellis, right this way. They've been expecting you. Expecting, Daniel blinked, but followed her down a hallway lined with framed photos of community centers, volunteers and kids with painted hands held high. He was led into a modest room where a woman waited behind a desk. Karen, we're the outreach arm of Haven Collective. Grace told us about you, Daniel's breath caught. She did, Karen nodded. She said you're handy, steady, good with people. We've been looking for someone like that for our housing support team, maintenance, small repairs. A friendly face. He sat slowly, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to people opening doors for him, at least not without expecting something in return. I don't have a resume, he admitted. Karen smiled. That's okay. Grace gave us something better. She gave us her trust. The interview wasn't about perfect answers. It was about stories, about fixing pipes for elderly neighbors, building a bookshelf from scraps, for Sophie's books holding things together when life fell apart. By the end, Karen handed him a paper. We'd like to bring you on. Part-time to start. Flexible hours. Enough to breathe a bit. Daniel looked down at the offer, overwhelmed. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a beginning. And as he stepped back into the sun, he texted just 2 words to Grace, thank you. They sat on the back steps of the shelter that evening, long after the dinner crowd had gone and the sun had dipped beneath the rooftops. Sophie was inside helping clean up, or mostly giggling, as the volunteers let her carry spoons like treasures. Grace held a chipped mug of tea, hands wrapped around it, like it grounded her. Daniel leaned against the railing, quiet, unsure how to ask what had been quietly simmering in his chest since the interview. Why me? He finally asked. Why help me like this? Grace looked down into her tea. Because someone helped me once. She let the silence stretch long and soft. I wasn't always Grace. I was just someone trying to survive. I lost everything in a single year, my job, my partner, my sense of direction. Her voice didn't shake. It was too steady, too well practiced. I ended up here, this very shelter, washing dishes, sleeping 2 doors down from the kitchen. Daniel turned to her, surprised. I thought you had it all together, she finished with a wry smile. I do now, but back then I didn't even have clean socks. He chuckled, but not out of mockery. Out of understanding, Grace continued. Someone gave me work, gave me a chance. They didn't treat me like a problem to fix. They treated me like a person who could still build something new. She looked at him, then not with sympathy, but with something steadier. That's why I gave you that interview. Not out of pity, Daniel. I saw how you treat people, how you talk to Sophie, how you show up even when you're falling apart. That's not weakness. That's grit. Daniel swallowed hard. You didn't break down that day, she said. You cracked. That's different. Cracks let light in. He didn't have words, but he didn't need them. She bumped her shoulder gently against his. You're not a project to rescue, Daniel. You're someone I respect. And for the first time, he let that sink in, not as flattery, but as truth. The apartment was quieter than usual. No cartoons, no scattered coloring pages, no tiny footsteps padding across the floor. Just the soft hum of the heater and the occasional cough from the couch. Daniel sat beside Sophie, gently brushing damp hair from her forehead. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes glassy. She clung to her stuffed rabbit like it could chase the fever away. Daddy, she mumbled, voice hoarse, my tummy feels like bees. He offered a weak smile. We'll make the bees go away soon. Okay. Truthfully, he didn't have much. The last bottle of children's fever medicine was nearly empty, and he hadn't been able to take another shift since she got sick. Then came the knock. Daniel frowned, surprised. It was nearly 8 p.m. and he wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door cautiously. There she stood, Grace. Hair slightly wind-tousled, coat damp from a light drizzle, holding a paper bag in one hand and a small pharmacy sack in the other. I heard, she said softly. Maggie at the shelter mentioned that you called off today. Daniel blinked. You didn't have to. She held up a hand. I know. That's why I did. Inside the bag, soup in a warm thermos, crackers, apple juice, a fresh bottle of fever medicine, and a new box of tissues with cartoon stars on it. Grace moved to the couch, gently kneeling beside Sophie with a quiet tenderness that surprised even Daniel. Hey, sweet pea, she whispered, brushing Sophie's curls. I brought something to help you feel better. Sophie blinked up at her, managing a small smile. The soup lady, Grace laughed softly. Guilty. They sat in the low light of the living room, Daniel with his daughter's hand in his, Grace refilling the humidifier without being asked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. But in that quiet hour, with fever slowly retreating and soup warming their hands, Daniel understood something love didn't always knock loud. Sometimes it arrived with tissues, soup, and no questions. The email had come that morning crisp and full of praise. Daniel sat at the edge of the couch, the glow of the laptop screen casting soft light across his tired face. Sophie, now recovering, lay asleep in the bedroom, her breathing steady, her favorite storybook resting gently on her chest. The subject line read, Lead Technician, Opportunity, Immediate Consideration. He'd been putting in hours at the repair shop when he could, fixing busted heaters, flickering lights, and aging water systems. His boss had noticed, so had the district office. Now here it was, a salaried position, a small office, a team under his name, in 60-hour weeks. Daniel rubbed his jaw. He could already hear the voice of the old version of himself, the one who once chased every promotion as proof he was doing right by his family. But that was before everything changed. Now the only promotion that mattered was being the kind of father Sophie could count on. Present, unrushed, whole. He clicked reply, typed a polite decline, then he shut the laptop. Later that day, Grace joined them for dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, Sophie's request. They ate at the little table by the window, mismatched chairs and paper napkins colored with stars. You didn't seem too excited about the email earlier, Grace said gently. Daniel smiled, watching Sophie giggle over her sandwich. It was a job offer, a big one, and I turned it down. Grace raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He continued, I didn't want to wake up one day and realize I traded bedtime stories for spreadsheets. She nodded slowly, her smile quiet but warm. That's the kind of strength most people overlook. Daniel glanced over at Sophie, now mid-bite, face smudged with soup. He didn't feel like he was falling behind. He felt like he was finally catching up to what mattered. It was a soft Sunday morning, the kind that carried no urgency. Grace had invited Daniel and Sophie to visit her place this time, not the shelter, not the grocery store parking lot where they first met, but somewhere she rarely shared with anyone, her rooftop garden. Daniel had imagined something small, a few potted herbs, maybe some flowers in crates. What he didn't expect was a whole rooftop transformed into a quiet green haven above the city. Vines curled along the railing. Wildflowers danced in the breeze. Raised beds held tomatoes, strawberries, even lavender. There was a wooden bench under a trellis, and just beyond it, a mosaic of colored tiles spelling out a name, Benjamin's Place. Grace knelt beside the small plaque embedded in the ground. My son loved planting seeds, she said softly. He never got to see most of them bloom. Daniel didn't ask how she lost him. He knew somehow that wasn't the point. Sophie wandered carefully along the stepping stones, touching leaves and giggling when a butterfly landed on her sleeve. This is beautiful, Daniel said. It was late afternoon when Daniel found Sophie sitting cross-legged in Grace's living room, a folded paper in her hands. Sunlight filtered through the window blinds, striping the floor in golden lines. Grace was in the kitchen, humming as she rinsed fruit. Sophie looked up, eyes wide. Daddy, I found a letter. Daniel froze. Sweetheart, we don't read other people's letters without asking. I thought it was for me, she whispered. It said, to the one who needs to know they're not alone. Daniel walked over and crouched beside her. Grace, now quiet, stepped into the doorway, towel in hand, watching. Sophie looked at Grace. Can I read it out loud? Grace nodded, slowly. Sophie unfolded the page, her little voice clear but soft. Dear someone, maybe you, maybe me. I want to tell you this. Life cracks us open, sometimes more than once. And still we grow. I thought I'd never plant joy again. I thought I'd never smile without guilt. But then I saw a little girl laughing in a grocery aisle, and a man crying thinking no one saw. I saw courage, I saw love still trying, and I wanted to believe again. If you've lost someone, you're not alone. If you're scared, I've been there. If you're tired, rest. There is no shame in falling, but oh, how beautiful it is to rise again. Sophie folded the letter gently and placed it on her lap. I think it was meant for both of us. Daniel looked at Grace. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she was smiling. It was the first time Daniel realized how much strength was hidden in Grace's silences and how much healing had been quietly blooming between all three of them. The air was cool and still as Daniel and Grace walked side by side down the quiet street, Sophie already fast asleep back at Grace's apartment under a blanket of stars taped to the ceiling. They didn't speak at first. The only sound was the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the hum of a distant street lamp buzzing against the night. Grace carried the folded letter Sophie had read earlier, her fingers brushing the creased edge over and over like it was a string keeping her tethered to the moment. Daniel finally broke the silence. She found it, he said quietly. Your letter. Grace nodded. I didn't know if he'd ever read it again, but I'm glad she did. They turned the corner, the moonlight spilling down the sidewalk. Daniel glanced over. She read it like it was written for her. And maybe it was. Grace exhaled slowly. I think I was writing it for myself, back when I couldn't talk about him, my son. Daniel stopped walking. Grace did too. He was 5, she said. He had this laugh, this ridiculous, contagious laugh. And then one day he was gone. The world kept moving, but I didn't. Not really. I left my giant, left the city, left everything. Daniel didn't speak. He just stood beside her still. I came here to disappear, she whispered. And somehow, that's when I started to be seen. Daniel looked up at the stars above them. My wife, her name was Julia. She died 2 winters ago. Cancer. I kept it together for Sophie, but sometimes I feel like I'm still waiting to fall apart. Grace touched his hand lightly. Maybe it's not about falling apart anymore. Maybe it's about letting someone else help you carry the pieces. Daniel looked down at her hand, then back at her. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt like they had to pretend to be whole. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but not the heavy kind. The kind that feels safe. The kind that fills in the cracks. One quiet step at a time towards something new. Grace hadn't planned on doing anything for her birthday. She never did anymore. No cake, no candles, no cards. Just another quiet day blending into the others, another year that had passed without the person she once lived for. But this time things were different. Daniel called that morning. You free tonight? I'm always free on my birthday, she said with a small smile. Not anymore, he replied. That evening she walked into Daniel's apartment to the smell of something vaguely burnt but sweet pancakes. It turned out made by Sophie and her dad, stacked a little unevenly and topped with too much syrup and a crooked candle. On the wall, there was a crayon drawing that read, Happy Birthday, Miss Grace, with stars and flowers, and a smiling stick figure in a red dress. Grace blinked quickly. Is that me? She asked, laughing. Sophie beamed. Yep, that's you with the purple hair clip. I didn't know what to get you, so I drew you a birthday. Daniel shrugged playfully. It was either that or a singing fish from the thrift shop. Grace laughed real and bright, the kind that crept up and surprised her. They ate pancakes on the couch using mismatched plates. Sophie curled up between them like she belonged exactly there, and she did. They talked about silly things, memories, and music about her son and his wife, but gently with kindness. Not with pain. Not anymore. After Sophie went to bed, Grace lingered a while longer, sipping warm tea at the small kitchen table. Daniel sat across from her, elbows on the wood, watching her as if her presence alone meant something. Because it did. You know, she said quietly, this is the first time in years I haven't felt forgotten. Daniel reached across and touched her hand palm to palm. You are not forgotten here. She looked around the little apartment, the paper stars still taped above Sophie's bed, the chipped mug holding crayons on the counter, the scent of cinnamon in the air. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was borrowing joy. She felt like she was home. It wasn't a party. It was something better. It was family. The apartment hadn't changed much, still small, still warm, still filled with Sophie's drawings and the smell of whatever Daniel tried to cook without burning. But there were signs, subtle ones. 2 mugs now sat drying beside the sink each night. A second toothbrush next to the first. A pair of slippers Grace's neatly lined up beside Sophie's rain boots. The living room held quiet chaos. Books, half-built puzzles, a pair of small shoes under the table. Sophie's newest masterpiece, a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, was pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a heart. They didn't talk about what they were. They just were. Grace still volunteered at the shelter. Daniel still turned down promotions that would cost him dinners with Sophie. They still met at the park on Saturdays, even when it rained. And every once in a while, Daniel would reach for Grace's hand while walking home, not because he needed to, but because it felt natural, because she was there, because she stayed. One evening, as Sophie slept and rain tapped gently on the windows, Daniel made tea while Grace folded laundry. No music played, no candles burned, just the hum of a life shared. He placed her mug beside her, sat down and smiled. You know, he said softly, I still remember the moment you touched my shoulder. That day, I think everything started then. Grace looked over, her eyes warm. And I remember the way you didn't flinch. Outside, the storm passed. Inside, the light remained, not dramatic, not blinding, just steady, like a hand on a shoulder. Always there.